We can see that the music helped us get together and the coffee break brought you back to life. And the number of people grew. We are ready to start this last session of today and the last session of the forum. But first of all, I would like once again to remind you about Peter Konchalovsky's prize and about the voting in which each of you would be able to participate. Those who have notepads like that, who came prepared for voting, those who do not have them, please come up here. There's plenty of them here. You can take them. I will ask the volunteers to pick up those notepads and distribute them. While the volunteers take the notepads, please open the last page of your notepad. The perforated one, which has 3 out of the 4 nominations of the artistic comment nomination for the cycle of articles by one author. Valentin Dyakonov, Sergei Khachaturov, Konstantin Agunovich, Milena Orlova, Olga Kabanova. Nomination the best internet blog dedicated to modern art problems. Hyperallergic, and its head Vartanyan was with us. Art Fag City, Willem Brandt is here. Redbox Review, Redbox Studio. People know different names. From Shanghai by Samantha. Rebel Art, Germany. Fortunately, Justin Bieber could not come to this forum, but he also closely watches the results of the voting. And OpenSpace.ru, the only representative from Russia. The best qualification work by an academic graduate dedicated to modern art process and criticism. Zalina Marshenkova, for her series of work in the Art Chronica. Yelena Yushina, Biennale as Actual Forms of International Cultural Collaboration, St. Petersburg State University. Dranichkina Olga, exhibiting modern art under the open sky, Moscow Stroganov Academy. Olga Glubokova, private collections of modern art in Moscow, Russian State Humanitarian University. And Yulia Yakovenko, the work of Yuri Cooper, Moscow Lomonosov University. All those works were present on the website. We will speak about the procedure for voting after our lunch break, when we start the awards ceremony. Right now, I will only speak about something that concerns each of you. After taking those notepads, you mark for the 3 of the 4 nominations, in all the nominations shown on the notepad. Don't whistle at me. The candidate. You mark the tick of the candidate, and your voice is added to the voices of our jury. Not to take too much time, about the voting procedure and about the jury, we'll speak later. We are starting our next session as the addressee of art criticism. So, the conclusive session of this forum will be attended by Alexander Panov, art critic and art expert, Alisa Loshkina, chief editor of Art Ukraine, Kiev, Valentin Dyakonov, art critic. Is Valentin in this room? Sergei Khachaturov, art critic, assistant professor at Moscow State University, named after Lomonosov. Konstantin Agunovich, chief editor of the Искусство magazine. Andrei Kovalov, art critic. The place that hasn't been occupied by Valentin Diakonov. And I will ask our guest, from Tate Modern, Nicholas Cullen. And Valentin will have to fight for this seat. And the main presenter at this last session will be chief editor of Vinzavod Art Review newspaper, Yelena Panteleeva. Good afternoon. I will share my ideas based on the experience of an editor who collaborates with art critics in a periodic press. It seems to me that criticism makes art move forward, providing points of reference and an outlook from a side. Art critic for painters is just like ornithology for birds. This articulates ideas and thoughts that are in the piece of art. So who are those? Is this criticism intended for? There are two parts. First, the professionals, part of the art community, curators, gallery owners, critics, heads of museums, painters, and artists. The second is general public that is interested in art. Those are the readers that line up for Moscow or Venetian Biennale, to the exhibitions at the Hermitage, who go to the lectures to the garage, who spend weekends in Vinzavod in Moscow. Readers who buy tickets to the lectures and visit lectures want to know more about how the art world is built. They expect reviews that guarantee the dialogue. Each newspaper is oriented towards its own target audience, but irrespective of the format, the readers are ready to have bright and justified texts on art. I can hardly imagine an author who, first of all, thinks about how he or she will be perceived by 30 to 50 million readers who will read through the magazine or the newspaper. Usually, this is something the editors think about. For the critic, his personal expression is important in reaction to a piece of art. His main purpose is to provide independent assessment and to say something new. The author must not be scared by offending people, and that is sometimes difficult. Quite often, it is desirable that authors do not write about corporate dinners, and the authors must be very much responsible for what they write, and it's best to base the text not only on knowledge but also on irony and sense of humor. A critic usually chooses one hero or one event out of many and shares his choice with the reader. There's nothing more terrible than oblivion. Ignoring an exhibition, not writing about an exhibition, not inviting the reader to an exhibition is also a position. Any publication on art must be also educational. A critic is a kind of intermediary between the reader and the artist. It doesn't mean that he has to explain all his ideas, but he must clearly formulate what he has to say. As soon as a critic enters the mass media, his text must be legible and understood by the audience. I, as the editor, do not order a text on an author, but actually want an independent analysis. And that is also what is also important is the availability of awareness so that the critic can use his previous experience in his current work. The task of any art publication is not to follow the tastes of the audience, but to form the audience. This is especially important for Russia, where the artistic community is small and only started to express itself quite recently. I think all the audience, irrespective of age and involvement, will vote for informal assessments, for non-banal assessments. I would share a nostalgic memory. There was a round table in Frankfurt that is called Art Criticism for Women. I can remember that critics told us how they create, how many cups of coffee they drink, how many cigarettes they smoke, seeking inspiration, how some of them are trying not to be close friends with curators or artists, but none of them said that they can imagine, especially the image of a reader who will read the newspaper. They said a dialogue with an artist is always important for them. They don't care whether the readers like their articles or not, but every author needs to render his opinion to the audience. So they don't think about the interesting relations. Mr. Birnbaum was the organizer of that workshop, and he is now the director of Modern Art Museum in Stockholm. I will finish by a quotation from him. Who has the right to criticize? I think it must be an educated, subtle person. He doesn't generate art. He assesses art without any PR for himself. A theater looks strange without an audience. The same relates to art. The dialogue is important. We know the world is imperfect. Without criticism, art will become a dry, mundane machine. Thank you. Thank you, Yelena. During your wonderful presentation, we were joined by Yelena Orlova, an art expert and critic. And one seat is still vacant. Yelena, you have the right to invite an opponent or a member of the working group to it, or wait until the first person that we announced would come. I would ask the members of the working group to respond to Yelena's speech. Who will be the first one? Andrei Kovalov. Andrei, you could take your bag to the podium. Andrei, you are taking part in a working group on the subject of audience, the recipient of art criticism, and you have the right to be the first one. Yes, I actually started talking about that in my previous contribution. Well, the matter is that I wrote a thesis. Before becoming an art critic, I wrote a dissertation on the art criticism of the 20s. And I can say that art criticism is in two dimensions. On the one hand, good criticism is the criticism that impacts here and now. So a critic comes from a gallery, from an exhibition, and writes about what he saw, what he has experienced here and now. which is different in principle from academic science. Academic science is intended for the future, and it should express some general categories about what is happening. But there's a paradox in that. The matter is that this format makes art criticism remain in history, because the essays by AIFAAR are rather seen as literature nowadays, while his inspiring critical articles is a historical fact, and they are relevant up to now, in the sense that every young person who wants to become an art critic must read AIFAAR, Benoit, and others. Follow the list that you know pretty well, coming down to some Andrei Kovalov, Yelena Orlova, and Kim Levin. That is the magnitude of our task. On the one hand, we work for a newspaper, and that newspaper will be used in, maybe used in a very peculiar way. On the other hand, that newspaper becomes history. And that is the magnitude of criticism. So speaking about the audience, a critic must address not only the audience, every publication. And since I worked as a freelancer for a long time, I can say that every publication has an expression. They say, we have this type of readers. Based on a lot of statistic material and a lot of experience, I can tell you that the reader does not exist as the editor imagines him. If the editor does not like the word discourse, that is the trouble of the editor. Well, that is especially typical of publications that built themselves, self-made publications. Let's take the Kommersant newspaper. The Kommersant is read not by Abramovich and Potanin, not the oligarchs. The Kommersant are read by newsstand people, because Abramovich and Potanin have an information bureau, each of them, that provide them with a digest. So they read their own newspapers.
But the Kommersant newspaper could be read only by the owner of those two kiosks, newspaper stands, because he has got no other sources of information to follow. Well, if we take Journal Officiel, it's read by the girls who sell this newspaper from another newsstand. It's not the princesses, it's the girls who want to become princesses that read this newspaper, and so on and so forth. You have to bear this in mind when you speak about the audience, the recipients of art criticism. Unfortunately, representatives of Kommersant newspaper are not in the audience, but we have representatives from L'Officiel journal in here. Yana Tolstaya, she is the representative of the Officiel journal, Department of Arts. Morning, good afternoon. My name is Yana, and I'm representing L'Officiel Ukraine. The readership of L'Officiel is very diverse. We have Officiel as such, we have Officiel Homme, and it's read by both princesses and girls wanting to become princesses. Our editing board constantly monitors the feedback from our readers, and I can disagree with you that we are not just a media. And we're not trying to catch up with other magazines and newspapers that cover, for example, travel, that cover news articles and so on. Many people like glossy magazines. I Yes, I agree with you that it happens so that in this world there's not too many princesses. The statistics is there and it shows us this fact. There's not too many princesses in this world. We have girls who want to become princesses, who still dust their rooms in dreams that they will become princesses, but some of them become princesses after they read L'Officiel. It's true. Milena Orlova, your turn. First, I'd like to tell that Yelena Panteleza's presentation was so impeccable that I believe if critics wrote articles like that, all magazines will die out. Because an article needs to contain a provocation, and the things that Lena talks about are so evident that there's no need to disclose them. I'm sorry for my comment, but I think it is like that. And I think Andrei underestimates our oligarchs, because as far as I know, they don't just read critical articles, but sometimes they write them. And sometimes oligarchs are even more experienced in our field of study than some of the critics. Since the topic of this session is the audience, I had some interesting experience where some 2 years ago I was editor-in-chief of Art Chronicle magazine, and before that I've been a critic, and I can tell that the world today is different, because when I became an editor-in-chief, it happened to be that apart from some virtual readers that I imagined for myself, there were real people who made up our readership, and this readership was very curious. It was completely different from the audience, from the readers of glossy magazines. And of course, they were different from the readers of a socially political newspaper. And I was contemplating this issue for a long time. I don't think that this is a horizontal cut of our social groupings. I believe that the people who read our magazines are usually collectors or gallery founders or museum or collectors, and we also have professional readers, so-called. It might be a poor student of an artistic educational establishment or an art school. And we cannot achieve the harmony between those two different groups of readers. It's really hard to keep this balance, so this magazine was interesting to everyone, but we strive to achieve it. If we want to attract a larger audience, we have to do it. Of course, there are some professional magazines that are aimed to target a specific circle of people, and those magazines usually develop their own language, which sometimes is wrongly understood even by the people who's inside this circle. But the interest that the audience pursues are completely different depending on the clique they belong to. And when I was working in Art Chronicle magazine, I managed to see the work of critics from a different angle. And their interests are also different, because imagine a curator who spends a lot of money on an exhibition, and then Sergei Khachaturov comes and he's in a bad mood, he doesn't see anything, and he was writing a critical article because he was not let by the guards in. And a huge work, a massive work, has to be cast away just because somebody didn't like the guards on the entrance to the exhibition. Or imagine there is a specific topic that Critic believes he needs to raise at every affordable moment, and it reduces this topic like it's a biennale, a festival, or something else, or a prize. And if it's repeated so many times, it's reduced to nothing. And when we speak about artists, curators, auctioneers, they're often they don't like that a critic sees only a very narrow, um, sees a very limited picture. He doesn't really see behind the curtains. Uh, he is not talking to the organizers, for example, to get to know more things. This problem exists. Maybe I'm taking too much of your time. You can take the word at every moment you wish to, but we can now pass the mic to another person who will be criticizing our colleagues now. Whose turn is that? Alexander Panov, your turn. 1, 2. I'll start with the following. I don't believe that criticizing is better than trying to preserve one's pride. I know my readership personally. I really know their names, their faces, their positions. In continuation of the previous topic and yesterday's topic, I don't work with bloggers. I'm not available on Facebook. Naturally, you can find everything in the internet today, but it's not me who is posting it there. But I can tell you one thing, as regards a reader in general. Well, I don't know about this reader in general, but I do know some of my specific readers, and those specific readers very often are PR departments of museums and galleries. I know that the Tretyakov Gallery PR department, or the PR service, is presented in here by Anna Katlara, and we can give the word to her. So my reader is a gallery employee, not often very successful, but still very ambitious, a gallerist. Successful galleries today even do not today are trying to keep critics at least write their names correctly, not speaking already about providing positive feedback. Well, it once happened that I was punched in the face by an artist who's sitting in here in this audience, but then we got on friendly terms, of course. But that's what happens if you write a critical article. Or sometimes it happens that somebody calls me at night and says, I won't ever say hello to you. What else happens? Sometimes critics praise those artists that are not very successful even. I think that what critics do, they try to please the losers. And of course, dealers are interested in getting those critical reviews. In Russia, the market is still immature. I mean, the contemporary art market is still immature, and I'm not dealing with any other market as such. So I'm using my own experience when addressing you. And I don't have any problems with dealers because they haven't yet haven't yet written about this field. Now, coming back to what Yelena said, she said banal things, she said commonplace things, but they are true. Because truism is a truism. And if it's not a truism, then it will become a paradox, right? And Yelena has already told that in her article about paradoxes. Again, being a critic in a newspaper and writing to a newspaper that doesn't live for one day only, but that knows its place in this market and its destiny. Well, for such critic as I am, for for such critics, they indulge in not in profane discourses. And for that, you require some sense of humor. But paradoxical thinking can unfortunately lead to very grave consequences. Because a newspaper, a critical review, is not a place where you would express a paradox. It's a venue to really attract the reader or to show yourself up, to try to provide a comparison between the artists you're describing right now and artists in the past. But you couldn't bring more than one paradox in one paragraph of your critical review. As regards this professional awareness, it's only natural. It gives you some background. Even if you have no money to live, well, imagine you are a cashier, and if you don't know how to be a cashier, you wouldn't go to service a customer on a cash desk, and you wouldn't apply for this job if you don't know how to do it. So professional background is necessary in this case, and in this respect. Unfortunately, there's a problem that we have two schools of critics. We have critics from Moscow and critics from St. Petersburg. And in Moscow, this division of labor is possible. However, in the regions, each critic has to write about different exhibitions, about various exhibitions, an arts exhibition, an exhibition of cats, or a dog show. And here, this professional background doesn't work. And this is a typical Russian specificity. And it's catastrophic because we lack professional critics. I know my readers in their faces, and I know my colleagues, each one of them by name and by titles. And most of them, the majority of them, is present in this room today. And this is becoming a problem nowadays. Definitely have to think about your readership. The other question is, do critics need to correspond to a specific standard? Do they have to subside to a specific format? Well, the format is something that you talk about when you go to a radio company. It's, you know that your song would not be put on rock radio or classic radio if you write a pop song. It's clear enough. Yesterday, Mr. Borovsky told us that we are made to follow the editor-in-chief's interests, but you can always find some common ground with your editor-in-chief. It's only a critic who easily yields to other people's taste, who cannot speak up and use their own voice. Now, regarding your responsibility as a critic, you see, if you don't spit on the street and if you don't litter on the street, it's also a responsibility, your social responsibility. So I make a comparison here as well. Thank you, Alexander. An interesting contrast to your notebook on your laps is an iPad in the hands of Alisa Loshkina. Alisa Loshkina, editor-in-chief of Art Market Ukraine magazine. Good afternoon, and I think that I will reiterate what's been said, because my comment is similar to the one that has been voiced by my colleague Helena Orlova. I'm representing here a leading arts publication, Art Ukraine, but as well as Yelena, I started my career as an independent critic. And when I started following this path, I didn't really think that I would become an art critic. And suddenly my life's changed. I started writing articles for a magazine of a very generic composition. It was similar to Moscow Billboard magazine, or at least it existed in the same niche. And when I started writing about art in Ukraine, we didn't see any particular acute or pressing publications. We hadn't had this broth of publications of the criticism as such. We didn't have this landscape. Because you require this broth of different articles, of different ideas and opinions to be able to express your own voice. So we require this breakthrough. We really were in a big need for that. And when I felt that the stage was empty, I decided that I needed to take this niche and that I had to start to apply more critical thinking to what was happening in our country. I can safely assure you now that it was a very successful strategy because I was I was soon followed by others. And it so happened that for 1 year or two this niche was empty, and then again an interest towards art criticism grew. A whole bunch of people appeared who became writing on the same topics, and I was glad that it finally happened. But on the next stage, I encountered a different situation. When I became an editing-chief of a magazine, it happened that the experience of an art critic and experience of an editor-chief of a magazine are two incomparable things. Because an art critic is a more creative person, an individual. When you become an editor-in-chief, you have to abide by the rules of self-censorship and the censorship rules of an environment and the landscape you live in. Because you become a professional and you're assuming different responsibilities on yourself, and it's a challenge in some way. And I've realized that I'm no longer capable of pursuing the strategy that I decided for myself when I became a critic. I thought then that since articles were becoming more and more critical in our country, they had that more and more critical content, it led to a very nihilistic approach in our country. Young people started to give this nihilistic hint or tint to their works, and I grew wary of that, because if you indulge yourself in constant arguments, in a constant attempt to find a trade-off between a dumb editor-in-chief who doesn't know the word discourse and a good and ever-understanding and ever-forgiving critic, I understood that it's not possible, because when I try to analyze all critical works, and I did that when I became an editor-in-chief, I came to realize that we lack clear-cut, wise, knowledgeable reviews. Not always acute, not always pressing, but enough to evoke response in a person. The response that would help to change people's opinions, to give them a peace of mind. I think it's my burden that I have to carry to be a critic, but it also has. But the profession of an editor-in-chief also has its own benefits, that you can moderate the process. Now, today in our country, there are not so many critical reviews. There are some attempts to provide a general analysis. There are some attempts to achieve a balance, a trade-off between a critic and a constructivist writer.
Well, Uh, you used a word that nobody understands, propedeutics. That's an introduction into a certain subject. Nina Gitashvili asks whether your magazine has feedback from the audience. You know, that's very interesting because I have little information. Unfortunately, we do not conduct any sociological studies about the hard copy versions of our magazine. It sells very well, but I had always had some fear because I don't know who reads my hard copy issues and I don't have a response from the audience. Apart from 20 artists and curators that I know, the writers do not write letters to us. It would be interesting to ask Lena whether the people write paper letters to you, but the internet version of our magazine, it was a very useful experience for me because we started to develop it about 1 year ago, and it's an invaluable source of some field research because we can see all the comments, all the responses to all the materials that we publish. And for me personally, it is a very useful tool. And I'm very proud that our web version is very dynamic. And to my mind, it is more interesting than just the hard copy version. I have a brief comment. What I said about editors. There are editors and editors. It's a great happiness to write directly to an editor. In continuation of my metaphor, I said I wrote directly to the editors, and there are people whom it makes happy. Alisa, your question remained unanswered. It's very interesting. And after that, I would ask Yelena Pantileva to answer whether writers write to her, or readers write to her, and what do they write about. I will answer briefly. We don't get so many letters, we get lots of telephone calls. Well, we don't. Yes, we used to have very many internet calls. Sometimes people write to our web page. Let's write down the address of Alisa Loshkina's publishing house. The as for the readers' reaction, young critics write to us quite often. They send us texts asking to evaluate and sometimes to publish. And quite sincerely, I spend a lot of time to analyze the text. I send it back, and they never come back because probably the young critics do not want to rewrite their texts, do not want to work on their texts, and to improve their way of putting words into certain order. I would like to react to the word format. A format is not valid only for a radio station. Each publication has a format, and it consists of the audience that reads the magazine. Some magazines are more interested in the persons who want news from the art market, and the art guide is more interesting to people who want to find a way to the museum. So there's not so many reviews in it, but it's very difficult to take account of the interests of the professional audience that wants reviews and the interest of, so to say, lay readers. But Vinzavod Art Review does it in the following way. We are oriented towards the young audience simply because Vinzavod organizes programs to support young artists, curators, and designers. And we quite often provide practical information about educational establishments, both in Russia and abroad. And it's very interesting to monitor that information and to add some general critical article say about education for young students. Mr. Diakonov wrote that, and he said a lot of negative things about the situation with education. Or, for instance, the exhibitions of young artists at Winzavod. When I order a review, say for the exhibition of Alexander Frolov, I'm sure that the critics will use their famous irony, and then Alexander will be crying and weeping while reading this article. But from my standpoint, that is good. Let him weep. Let her weep, but then she will find it easier to improve on her art. I will have only one remark. I think the letters that you send for the critics to improve themselves, they are resent to other publications which may publish them. I would be glad to hear that. I am supportive of a new generation of critics. I sympathize very much with everyone who sits here, but I want some fresh blood, because we need new opinions by younger persons. Let them work. I'm ready to give them green light. Thank you. I will ask Nicholas Kalinin.
What do you expect from your audience?
That's a good question. I suppose the first thing to say is that the audience is changing massively, and in some ways much quicker than art criticism or museums can respond because of the internet. Basically, it's that simple. And so, to give you an example of Tate Modern and its relationship to its audience, I think as a museum, we're seen as being one of the museums that have led being very audience-focused. So famously, we sort of really monitor what people say about our exhibitions, how many people attend the shows, etc., etc. Sometimes, arguably, you could say to the detriment of our projects, because if you become too aware of what people want, it becomes like market research. So you're preempting doing anything too risk-taking or radical by just giving people what you think they might want, rather than what they might actually enjoy or respect. Obviously, in terms of, say, a website, which is becoming almost a parallel universe to a museum or to an art publication, the big difference now is that when you publish a text, so when a critic, say, publishes a text on a website, it's no longer the definitive standpoint on that issue or that artist. Rather, it's an opening salvo in a discussion. So you have these, chain of responses which vary in understanding and intellectual credibility. But that's a major, major shift. And I think it's very interesting that what we haven't really said so far is that certainly in the UK and in America, the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about the death of art criticism, about the impossibility of art criticism, because now the art world is such a sort of inflated machine, it almost negates the possibility for criticism to have any impact. So to give you a few local examples from the UK, some of the artists in Britain who are most famous are actually the least critically esteemed. So, for example, Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin. Neither of those artists is given good reviews, and yet both are the most famous. And so there you have an example where, in a way, art criticism could be seen as being redundant. That whatever people write, it might not change the public's perception of that artist. Andy Warhol said something rather wonderful back in the 70s. He said, "I don't read my reviews, I weigh them." Meaning, it doesn't matter what people write as long as they write about you in bulk and en masse. I think that's very interesting. The other thing I just wanted to add into the discussion is, what is an art critic? And I think we need to really think about this carefully. And what's the difference between an art critic, an art historian? It's not straightforward. And some critics, their job is to basically review shows and define what is good or bad about an artist or an exhibition, and to therefore be detached from, say, an artist or a gallery or the art world. Other critics have more of a role as a kind of chronicler or a commentator, and they basically document what is happening around them. And of course, by necessity, they have to be implicated with the art world, with the ecosystem. But they have a very, very important role. Those are the texts that, as an art historian, as I am, those are the texts you go back to when you're doing primary research about any given period. So I think we need to think about that very carefully as well. It's not monolithic, and I think the audience is not one thing, and an art critic is not one thing. I suppose the other thing I should say as a curator, I've heard a couple of things about this role between curators, artists, art critics. And the idea being that art critics have to kind of avoid curators, with the implication being that curators are sort of pursuing critics to win their favor, which in my experience is not true at all. And in a way, to be a good curator, you basically have to work on an exhibition or a project and completely ignore what you think people might say about it. You have to just block it out, work on the project, do your absolute best, and only when it opens, you basically lose control of the project. It's no longer your project, it becomes the public's domain, and then you can read people's responses, whether they're an art critic who writes for a newspaper or lots of comments on the internet. But in a way, again, there's a shifting relationship between a curator and an art critic. At times you have to be completely separate, and at times you can then take on board what people say, but it's not fixed or static. I think those are the things I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. Nicholas Kalin.
Nicholas Callinan, the curator of the 20th Century Department, Tate Modern Gallery, London. Konstantin Agunovich, chief editor of the Искусство magazine. Thank you. Well, nothing comes to mind. For a writing person, so I will copy-paste. I think that because we were finally called to the podium, that brought a culmination to the whole event, in the sense that we are talking, like Lena said, about quite obvious things, inarguable things, and by the end of each session, God grant us to formulate the problem, to raise the problem that could develop into a discussion. It seems to me that art critic has indirect relation to many issues that we were talking about. And only when we started talking about the audience, it turned out that we don't have an audience. And there are doubts of whether art criticism exists at all, because the functions performed by the people who we call art critics are not always those of art criticism. Alessa told us yesterday how she was lucky to see a whole plane reading her article. Once I had the same experience on the metro, but that was only once. And any chief editor of a magazine that has to do with anyone having to do with magazine management knows the horror of a situation for any glossy or non-glossy magazine, that when the magazine is only read by women around 35, and everything ends with those women coming to you and telling you, you have a wonderful edition, you don't have to change anything, and that is sociologically justifiable. People who have come to a new level, they don't really do anything but read art criticism. I saw a very beautiful girl reading my article on the metro. Did you make her acquaintance? Did you make her acquaintance? Did you find out why she was reading it? Well, I'm very timid. I'm very timid.
I have the microphone, so I just wanted to add one thing, which is to say maybe what we should think about is the art critic and the audience collapsing, and maybe the art critic has been reincarnated as the audience. So we're losing this kind of authorial voice of one person being able to impart what is good or bad, and the masses are taking that role on themselves, which I think is very scary and exciting. I mean, if you look at websites, often some of the comments are very banal, some of them are offensive or stupid, but the overall idea is basically very egalitarian. And if you think about what social media is doing, not just in the art world, think about the Arab Spring we've had over the last year, which was basically affected by social media. I mean, it wouldn't have been possible without Facebook, Twitter, Blackberries. The same happened in London. We had riots this year. I mean, that's not a good thing, but they happened allegedly through the proliferation of social media. So it's having a huge effect. And I think we need to kind of break down these categories and think about something much more radical and a kind of hybrid.
Thank you. Константин, вы
Я
продолжите.
продолжу, да. И вот оказывается, что потом изобретают.
It happens so that the publications, they try to invent their readers, because if everybody shared the same reader, then the publications would be the same, and then you would have to think what kind of reader you want to have. For a glossy magazine, it's the basics, it's the basic thing, because as opposed to the ideal press, the ideal media that reflects the normal life, glossy magazines do not do that. They create their own universe. And that is why it is a pleasure to work in a magazine like that. It's cool, and you can do whatever you want to. Because you conceive an ideal, unreal world, and no one would ever trouble this world. No one will ever intervene with your thinking. But as soon as you start describing the life, you are getting punched in your face. This is the life reaction and the feedback you get from your audience. But does it mean that you have to adjust to your audience, that you have to yield to its tastes and interests? Well, yes. Together with Ms. Panteleva, we share the same idea that the professional language today is being now reduced to something a pseudo language, because the language that we have to use has to reflect the real life. And if the language that describes a work of art is as non-understandable as the work itself, then we caught in those traps and of the language. And we need to understand, how do we have to communicate with the audience, either a virtual one or a real one. I think it's the question whether we are able to become less difficult, to go to a lower level of the reader, in the same way trying to adjust to the artist himself. Maybe it's an attempt to explain yourself something that you don't understand. Very often, when you try to be adequate in your description, you find certain formulas, certain wordings that are so fixed in your mind, that become so rigid that you will never be able to take them out. That even if the artist writes something different or makes something different, you would still use the same cliches. Another thing is a personal opinion of a critic. Because it's interesting to listen to a critic, what kind of reader he is imagining himself. And then you will be able to see whether this critic is ready to flirt with the reader, whether he is showing his nerdness, or whether he is trying to go down to the reader's level, so to say. And I'm putting a comma, not a dot, in my sentence, so I hope I will continue. Who has other comments? Yes, it's an interesting topic you're discussing here. Speaking about the necessity of critics. Well, I haven't been able to thank the organizers of the forum. Now I'd like to do that, so thank you. Thank you. For 3 days, we've been sitting in here, and we've been discussing some general topics. We're discussing the function of criticism. We're discussing whether we are needed. We discuss discourses. Sorry for this word, because it's became a buzzword. I mean, discourses and other connotations. And again, this is a wonderful venue, again, thanks to the Presidential Library of Boris Yeltsin and so on and so forth. But close to us is an exhibition hall called Manege, where an exhibition of Ilya Glazunov is taking place right now, and where I would like to invite our foreign guests to have a look. And where, in the morning, you can see huge queues in front of the building. Those people who are standing in those queues, they don't know this fancy word, discourse. They don't read critical articles or reviews. They don't know our colleagues, critics in faces or in names. But this vox populi has managed to convince the organizers of the exhibition to extend the time period up to 1 month. People pay the money for that. They stand in a queue. They don't need anything apart from that. We are discussing the art in reality. Alessia had explained us that art is the future, it's something that we can forecast, that is something that we can analyze, and there's reality. And this reality is behind the walls of this wonderful library in a different building, in the building of Manege, and we are not needed. They don't need us, and we don't need them. Yelena, a couple of words. I don't think that critics should yield to the format. There was a wonderful presentation during which a concept of the pseudo-language was described, which sometimes is even not understood by a critic. And I think that this pseudo-language or artificial language has to exist only in those magazines that are made for people who use this language. Others have to use other words, because to describe a work of art is an art in itself. Kirill Gavrilin, we give the floor to him. He's representing the art gallery named after Stroganov. As regards the topic of the discussion, like Helena, I'd like to give a reference to a precedent, historical case. We speak about the itinerants, the movement of itinerants, who became the icon of Russian arts due to their policy, unusual policy. Of course, this policy was based on sponsors' money, on the money given by Tretyakov. Talents, and of course, it was based on the talents of such people as Stasov and Kramskoy, the artists. But what they did is they aimed their works to provinces, to regions, and a couple of months, the itinerants became the leaders of the Russian art market. They have conquered this market. How can we explain that? The explanation to that is that the exhibitions in the Imperial Russia were organized only under the aegis of two academies, the Academy of Fine Arts in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. And the artists in this movement, they described the regions, they described the normal life of Russian countryside. And I can't remember any Western experience where museums, galleries, and other organizers of exhibitions would start tackling the issues of the countryside, like Bolivari, who got lost in Venezuela amongst Indian villages and small settlements. This museum can boast to possess a huge range of different Russian pieces of art, Russian works of art. And I've remembered that due to my personal experience. I haven't expected this reaction that you are showing in here. A year ago, me and we, together with the Hungarian embassy, had to support one provincial, regional museum, which was lost in the nowhere, somewhere close to the Kama River in Trans-Ural region. Two towns were there, Solikamsk and Usoria. Those towns have to do with the Stroganovs family. And there was another town called Berezniki, which is overwhelmed by chemical clouds and chlorous vapors today. Well, it was a whole agglomeration of different towns and cities that were connected to Russian heavy industry. Business in these cities is represented by Uralkim, Uralkali, and Lukoil Perm. So they were very large industrial players. And the Hungarian embassy had only one particular objective. They wanted to establish connection with Finno-Ugrian province, which stretches starting from these territories. It seems that this Perm region has a lot of artistic things. They have some galleries. They have a very large city close to it, nearby Yekaterinburg, with certain museums and galleries as such. But the distance you have to go from this big city to the smaller provincial towns is 350 kilometers. And what happens in those provincial towns and those regional places is that the citizens of those towns, people in there, they don't participate in this artistic life. They don't understand that it's in their world that such exhibitions are taking place. They can't just treat such events as large and important media events. When we visited this exhibition ourselves, it was pretty interesting. It was organized by a group of Hungarian artists, Morph, who have interpreted postmodernist trends of the 20th century, and they produced something that doesn't have any relation to the real life. For Eurakim, it was just a tick to put on their list of things to do. For the Hungarian embassy, another tick. For us, a third thing. And I haven't expected any reaction, any response from the citizens. But this region really grew into a hornet's nest. Professional artists, professional artist community really created a buzz around this event. Though small that the artist community may be there, they started writing in local newspapers describing the exhibition. Then newspaper journalists followed their example, and it went like a snowball. And this multi-million population started speaking about the exhibition, and the Hungarian ambassador one morning got on his desk a pile of documents with news articles, news clips, some journalist essays related to this exhibition. And it was a very strange and unexpected response. And then I got to realize that it's the same situation as was with the itinerants. It seems to me that the reader, the spectator, living in a vast country, doesn't see what's happening in the capitals, because they are not a part of this process, these two towns, two cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this innocent event, this innocent project evoked a response that no one expected. Maybe we should follow in the threads of Barat Gelman and Suited Bolivari museum organizers, and we should follow the path of itinerants in order to reach out to normal folk living in this vast country. Because these people, they also discuss something, they also want to converse, they also want to live. And the blogs, in those blogs, we saw quite an acute reaction, a response from students, because this territory can boast a whole lot of different designer institutions and others. So this is a very interesting case I wanted to share with you. All right, we are moving forward. Yelena Shurna, I'm a consultant of social and cultural projects. I'm glad that I got to get this mic after the previous speaker, because he already told what I wanted to say, at least half of it. And throughout this whole discussion, I was thinking, what kind of question we try to answer now? It is clear that inside this sealed community, artistic community, where everyone knows everybody's faces, we understand what art criticism is and who reads the reviews. But go out of those boundaries, think out of the box. What happens there, behind those curtains? And I believe that I need to tell that we've got a new type of an art critic. During the last years, a lot of fora were organized in St. Petersburg, where the same issues were touched upon, how art has to interact with different social layers. There was an art forum where a lot of foreign guests came to discuss how to interact with public. And representatives of the government, the representatives of the state could not understand at this forum, how can you display such now works of art as prepared by Maria Abramovich. And another topic was discussed in St. Petersburg, how culture can influence the life of a city. And this issue was discussed by developers, the developers who have got some allotments, who've managed to obtain certain land plots, and they need to develop them and to attract people who would live there. And they said, and they discussed that the art could help in this question. The last forum I've managed to attend took place in the Marble Palace on 25th of October, and it was conducted by Martin Gelman, and the motto of it was the new cultural policy for St. Petersburg. However, it was more of a promotion of the United Russian Party, like your own presentation right now. No, I'm finishing already. I'm coming to an end. And the quotation was, "Modern art needs modern brains." End of quote. Dmitry Medvedev. So, coming back to this discussion, Marat Gelman promised that we need to decentralize ourselves. But I think, and I believe that in order to break this wall between an enclosed society, an enclosed community, and its spectator that treats it very strangely, like the Committee on Architecture that I was referring to that didn't understand the best examples of our contemporary art. In order to break this wall, we need to reach out to the masses. And we need to give an opportunity to an ignorant public to discuss what they have seen. Because an interest towards this project of an allotment was very interesting. No one ever touched upon this link between the architecture and the art. Thank you very much. I would like to get some feedback from the audience.
May I provide one brief comment? I have a proposal. I think developers should settle a critic in every home, in every apartment house, and that will attract people there. I wanted to ask the audience, who is in favor of the Forum Art and Reality staying in St. Petersburg next year? Okay, let's be friends. Yelizaveta Belskaya, art expert, Kiev. Good afternoon. I want to come down to real life, to mundane matters. I would like to ask the experience of the authors and editors. How do you decide about the remuneration for the freelancers and professional authors? Do you pay for the online versions, and how do you assess their labor? Well, I'm not only a critic and a collectioner, but also I'm head of the department at the newspaper. I pay my authors from my own pocket. Alexandra, please write something to us. We pay the royalties, we pay the remuneration, and the volume is not very big. It's only several pages. So by definition, there aren't too many authors, but I monitor the payment bills very carefully because we must respect the labor, and we cannot allow ourselves not to pay even a start-up author. If I allow a person to publish something, we will pay him or her something. Of course, the payment varies depending on the critic's experience and name. I can support that because once I got paid by Lena Panteleva for an interview with Julia Kagansky, and that was published in September. And I honestly I bought a coffee and a cake on that. Yes. Yeah, I think the forum is a success because Yelena Panteleva made an offer for me, and at least I can buy a coffee. I'm very glad. Actually, I'll explain why I will be glad to accommodate you. I think it's a good Western practice when the audience uses someone's name as a benchmark. So they go to a show to see some actor and they want to read a paper and they want to learn a name of a specific person. And I think we should make authors columns. We've just started with our publication. We are only 2 years old because the independent opinion is very valuable. But any publication has several articles, and the editor's task is to fit that article, however provocative it is, to fix it into the general outlay of the publication. We don't only publish analytical articles. Actually, the studio column is very popular, and everyone wants to learn how the painters live and where they work. And the concept of the overall edition is to be mutually complementary and logical. I can share Ukrainian experience. I can say that the situation is not that good as with the Vinzavod Art Review. I don't know the situation in Russia, but publishing magazines in Ukraine is becoming more and more expensive. Fortunately, we are a private initiative, but we've felt certain financial difficulties related to payment of for it was also related to the disorganization of our marketing department because our business component was very inefficient. Now we are actively engaged in that. So I, as the editor, initially had to improve the intellectual level of the magazine and to do the visual rebranding. But at the second stage, our task is a business task and financial development. Yes, we pay for the articles. Yes, we had some difficulties with that, but I take pride in being able to be a profitable edition, and we try to pay out all of our debts and not to repeat the mistakes that we made before. Yeah, the economic situation is far from being very bright here. I would pay more to the authors than I'm paying because they deserve it. But my personal tragedy was the Black Square magazine. It closed down because of the crisis. Yes, it's very expensive to publish here. Well, then I did not mean. I didn't say that the payment was little. Just the coffee and the cake were very expensive. Yes, I want to pay all the authors and on time, and we pay as much as we can. Of course, we don't have the remunerations that the glossy magazines can offer, but people work for money, not only for the sake of art. We have 3 more questions in the room, and let's limit ourselves to that. Yana Volkova, Astrid Mania. Yana Volkova. I will take the microphone there. I see it that the question about the audience for art criticism is the question about who needs an intellectual product today. Because judging by the discussion and the participants of the process during those 3 days, I can make a conclusion that the commercial institutions and non-commercial institutions that are funded by some commercial entities are interested in feature publications and texts that would be a tool of their PR strategy and marketing strategy. The art bloggers, journalists who work with art blogs, their product are texts rather promoting modern art or contemporary art with wider audiences, and those texts are hardly intellectual products. They seem to be something reduced, very interesting, of course, very rapidly developing, but you cannot call them full-fledged intellectual products in the traditional sense. So, as I see it, the answer to the question who wants an intellectual product nowadays is only one. The product is needed to the participants of the intellectual process, and the question of how that motivation can interact with other social institutions and how can it reveal itself. Those are, in principle, interesting questions. I would recall the movie about Gilles Deleuze when he was asked about his reader, and he said that he was really struck by a reaction from a paper factory when he was writing his philosophical book, and the workers of a paper factory wrote to him a letter saying that the philosophical category of a fold that the book was about is especially important in their lives, and that really made an unforgettable impression on him. And I think, who wants it? Who needs it? The answer is only the participants of the process. And a comment by our foreign participant, Astrid Manu.
Comment to make. I actually just wanted to ask a question, and we're talking money. Now, I do have a comment about the payment. I always make myself very unpopular by raising the issue of money and by advocating, proper payment for the work done. And I would strongly encourage everybody to not make these massive differences between young writers and elder writers, because if you want to draw in younger talent, I think they should be paid for their work. Like when I was editor of the magazine, we always paid the format, regardless who wrote it, whether acclaimed critic or somebody young. Because if you want to get those young voices also in, beside the experienced one or the people who have seen something for 20 or more years, I think they should be paid fairly for the work they're doing and not for the name, but that's a personal opinion. The question I have out of interest and curiosity is, how are your magazines financially covered? Like, do you have private people backing you? Do you live off advertising? How do you basically financially support these magazines?
I will start. The paper that I had is a monthly. It's an 8-page month publication, and it is funded by the Vinzavod Center, and it was created to promote that center first and foremost. But you don't want to be an advertisement for one organization. We collect news from all over the world. We're interested in the overall situation, and the events that happen in Russia are seen against the background of world news. For instance, we had a cycle of publications about art centers that are similar to Vinzavod, and art centers that occupy the space of former factories or publishing house, some industrial areas which are used to exhibit art. Our objective is not to be a profitable project. We don't want to earn money on that, but certainly, as any good business project, it should have some partners. And of course, We publish commercials and we try to be at the break-even point. That's normal practice. We've nearly come to that, and the advertisers that put commercials in our newspaper are galleries, design companies, festivals, and other artistic events or creative companies who want to be associated with this world. One-time grants, commercials, and we're lucky we're leasing out 2 stories. We have a big building in downtown Moscow, and that's where the money comes from mainly. Our magazine is a 200-page edition that is coming out every 2 months in Ukrainian and English version, and starting with September this year, a Russian version. We are totally funded by private persons, and it was intended to be a publication whose person is the promotion of art. And we do have ads in our magazine. The problem is, as far as we know, most of the money that similar Western publications get is by placing ads from galleries and museums, but that is not typical for Ukraine. The galleries don't have a practice of paying magazines for ads in those magazines. At least they don't pay adequate money. So unfortunately, currently, we cannot be funded by using ads. We do have some advertisers, but the problem is that the quality, the desirable quality of print makes this project quite costly. And the price of the cost is nearly the same as the retail price, because very few people in our country can pay enough money to us so that we could at least return the basic costs. So yes, we incur losses. We're funded by our owners, and we're grateful. Two private publishers. Is the question about what we think of ourselves or where we get the money? I'm a mercenary of financial industrial capital with appropriate bourgeois outlooks and mindsets. In this situation, I can say only about the Art Chronica magazine. It was funded when I was the chief editor, and it's probably funded yet by a non-commercial foundation which also funds Kandinsky Prize for Modern Art. And although the fund supported that magazine, the task was to turn it into a business project through ads and through other sources. Well, this is the case that Lena Panteleva describes. We tried to achieve financial success. That's everything I can say. We started talking about art and finished with reality, with money. Yana, perhaps the last word is yours. Are you going to speak about reality or about art? I would like to respond to the last two questions. Because mine is a glossy publication, we are a commercially successful magazine. We're absolutely commercial, and despite the the people that read us are no Cinderellas. At the same time, we don't have debt. We pay to all the authors. If you're interested in specific price, Elizaveta, I can voice them. It's $30 a page, $60 two pages. And if you're talking about exclusive materials, the prices can come up to $300, $400 dollars a page if you provide materials from Venetian Biennale. Our commercial success allowed us to start publishing the male version of this magazine, and we don't use barter with our advertisers. If the working group doesn't have anything to say, I invite everyone to approach forks, knives, and plates. And I invite you in 1 hour back to the award ceremony.